Hello, hello, creatives. Welcome back to our second session, or actually it's our third. It's our third session in our writing marathon series. And today we are talking about recovery. And specifically, we're kind of getting into our conversation a little bit more about resistance and Einstein's solution to all of these kinds of creative problems. And that is what he called combinatory play. So we're going to talk a little bit about what combinatory play is, how you can work it into your own writing routine or your life routine, and how it can really help you to approach resistance in a new way. And I think a much more effective way, to be honest with you, than this sort of doing battle with that sort of writer's block. Which seems to be kind of the method of choice as far as if you think about Stephen Pressfield's War of Art, for example, it feels like it really should be a battle. It's supposed to be a war, but I think that Einstein has something to offer us on this point, and so we're going to get into talking about what that is today. So before we get into how we can use combinatory play to help us out, let's talk a little bit about what it is. So here's what Einstein had to say. He said, combinatory play seems to be the essential feature in productive thought. Combinatory play seems to be the essential feature in productive thought. And I think this is really valuable for us. So Einstein, when he would encounter a difficult problem, when he was trying to work something out, his solution wasn't just to sit there and kind of like bang his head against the wall. He would go and play his violin, for example. You might be familiar with this same strategy used by Sherlock Holmes, right? Sherlock Holmes would play his violin when he was feeling stuck on a case and he needed to think it through. His solution, again, was not just to sit there and do battle with it, like wrestle with it, but he would play the violin as one possible solution. I had the great privilege of interviewing Spiros Mikalakis, who is a mathematical physicist, and he consulted on films like Ant-Man and things like that. And he was also he solved one of the 13 Millennium Problems. And he talked about using this same exact strategy, that like when he was trying to beat his head against the wall and trying to do battle with the problem that he was trying to solve, it wasn't going well. He had to start approaching the problem in sort of a cooperative way, and to kind of short circuit that feeling of being at war with his own mind and at war with this problem. The solution instead was to switch gears, right, and to kind of think about it a different way and to approach it in a different way that was not combative but rather cooperative. And I think that's part of what Einstein is getting at in this idea of combinatory play. It's this idea of doing something that is analogous or related. In last week's session, I called it analogous play. It's something that frees your mind um, in order to be able to really engage, to kind of get out of your own way, right? If we need some more encouragement along these lines, another great creative thinker, Steve Jobs, said creativity is just connecting things. It's just connecting things, right? And I think of like a giant bin of Legos, right, when I think about this. And he went on to say in that same quote that oftentimes creative people are sort of surprised by the question of like, well, how did you do what you did? A lot of times the answer is I don't actually know, because it feels like you just ended up seeing the solution rather than like battled for it or like did something sort of proactive where it ended up resulting in a solution. Instead, it just sort of, sometimes it can sort of feel like the solution just sort of falls in your lap. And so that question is hard to answer sometimes, and maybe you've had that experience as a creative. Somebody, how did you write that? How did you come up with that idea for that story, right? How did you come up with that solution to that story problem? Or how did you, whatever, name it, right? And if you've ever struggled with how to answer that question, it's probably because you've engaged in this creative kind of thought process without probably even knowing that you were doing it. This thought process of combinatory play, where you just sort of allowed the story to emerge and to take on its own form, and the solution eventually kind of presented itself. I think I've mentioned in other videos that one of my favorite creative mantras is trust emergence. And I think that's part of what we're getting at here as well. We're getting at this idea that the story will come, that the ideas will flow. And the idea behind this idea of play is that you free yourself from the stress of doing battle with a process that feels like it's not working, and you just sort of step to the side. You just step out of its way, and you do something else that frees your mind to do something else to make those new associations. So what is combinatory play? Oh, one other example. I don't have a quote for this one, but one other example, as the story goes, that Archimedes, her famous guy who ran around saying "Eureka" all the time, right? That Archimedes discovered the principle of buoyancy when he got into his bathtub and it overflowed, right? And it was sort of this idea of like, well, he's doing something that looks like not work, that is taking a bath and relaxing, and actually the solution to this problem that he had been wrestling with sort of presented itself, and his brain was in a place, right? His mind was in a place where he could observe, that's the solution to the problem that I've been looking for. And you can, if you do a search on combinatory play, you'll find all kinds of stories of like people who have solved problems. One of my favorite ones, actually, I'll give you one other example. One other favorite example of this is that the scene from Apollo 13. If you all know the scene I'm talking about, where they have to figure out the solution to this problem of the carbon dioxide filter, which is not working on the module, and they dump this entire box of stuff out on the table in the movie. That is, in the movie, happened a little bit differently in real life, but in the movie, the way it's dramatized is they dump this box of stuff out, random odds and ends of things, right? Dump it out on the desk, and they say, you need to figure out how to make a filter that fits into a hole that looks like this. And all the only filter that they have is a square one, right? And he says you literally fit like a square peg in a round hole, and figure out how to make this thing work. And they had to figure out how to work with all of these different materials that weren't designed for this purpose, but they had to figure out a way of putting these things together in a new way, right? And without sort of freeing yourself up to explore any and all possibilities, right? You sometimes can't find the solution if your brain is only going on the one track that you sort of laid down for it. Then you sort of eliminate the possibilities that might be the better choices, um, that lie outside of that established track, right? So um, yeah, so that's what combinatory play does. So combinatory play is about forging these new connections. It's about allowing your mind the space that it needs to form these new associations, to put two unlike things together, and to observe how they're connected. Okay, so combinatory play is all about the exploration of associations. It's about freeing your mind from its sort of like, well, lamps only do this one thing. Well, what if lamps could do something else? What if we just threw the rule book out, and what if we said, what else is possible here, right? And as storytellers, this is sort of our trade, right? This is what we do. We are inventive in this way. And so I feel like this is such an applicable strategy or way of thinking about the world for the kind of work that we do. So we're working on trying to open up the mental space for these kinds of new associations. That's where this is at. Okay, so let's think about some different ways in which we can do this. How is it that we can do these kinds of activities so that we're opening up this kind of mental space? Einstein, I already mentioned, Einstein and Sherlock Holmes, both, the solution was to do a related activity like playing the violin. Okay, so music and math, I mean, everybody kind of knows those things are very closely related, I think. And it's sort of a way of engaging the mind, while sort of freeing up parts of your mind to just sort of work in the background, right? Like background processes, just sort of work while you're doing something else. Okay. Other examples, as creatives, we might think, well, what about coloring in a coloring book? What about doing some painting, or drawing, sketching, some kind of other writing, right? If you're, working as, on a script, what if you were to try your hand at some poetry instead? Or what if you were to try a short story? You know, find a different project. And, sometimes we think, oh, well, if, I've seen these memes before, maybe you have too, right? That come up of like sort of making fun of the fact that when you're deep in a project, that's when all of these other ideas kind of start to come out. And you're like, just leave me alone. I need to focus on this one project. Well, yes and no, but maybe it is that, if you get stuck on the current project, that you can pick up one of those other ideas and kind of see where it takes you. And think about it in this sort of way of combinatory play of like freeing your mind up to think about a story that's completely unrelated allows your mind in the background to be working on this other story that you're sort of struggling with at this point. What about some other sort of analogous activities or other activities that might work for you? Um, Going on nature hikes, getting out into nature, going to an art museum can be a great way, just wandering through, right? Wandering through, going to a garden, going into your own garden, but maybe going to an actually formally laid out garden could be a great thing. The zoo, like wherever it is that you find relaxation, inspiration, gives your mind something to engage with, but isn't taxing. That's kind of the key, I think, right? Going to a coffee shop and just doing some people watching can be great, right? Go, insofar as you're able to do that at this point. Um, I also think that doing things like, I mean, this is the writing marathon series, right? And so we've been talking a lot about the analogies between exercise and creative work, and exercise is a great thing to do, right? Going running, doing, taking a dance class, going rock climbing. Rock climbing is great, by the way, because it requires you to focus on the activity at hand. It requires you to be fully present in the moment. And that means that it completely frees up your subconscious to do its thing. So I actually love rock climbing for that reason, because it's an activity again that requires your presentness to be safe first of all, but it requires your presentness to engage in the activity. But again, it sort of like takes the burden off of your creativity and allows it to run in the background. So basically, whatever it is that you find helps you to have that sort of release, that mental release, find those activities. Keep a running list of activities or things that you can do or that you have found helpful, that give you that feeling of of creativity, of release, of relaxation, of restoration. Because part of what we're talking about today, right, is the idea of recovery, of refilling the creative well and being able to then come back to a project with feeling like you're ready to take it on. So I would keep a running list. Your list is going to look very different from anybody else's. It'll look different from mine or from anybody else's. But I would definitely recommend that of just, and if you need a break, grab that list, find something that's easily accessible, and take 5, 10, 30 minutes if you can, take a day, and just really pay attention to those times when you're feeling blocked, you're starting to run into resistance, and recognizing, hey, maybe this is my mind telling me I need to step away, I need to do something analogous, I need to pivot, I need to grab that coloring book that's been sitting there, right, and just sort of doodle for a while or color something, or go, sit out in the sunshine in my garden and just kind of soak it all in. Pulling weeds in a garden is great, right? And that's tying to my second point of advice, which is to do some work with your hands. And this is one of my favorite quotes of all time, from Agatha Christie. She says, "The best time for planning a book is while you're doing the dishes." How encouraging is this, right? This is Agatha Christie. The best time for planning a book is while you're doing the dishes. Why is that? Why is that? Again, because it's sort of like mindless, busy work. Your hands are occupied, and so your mind is sort of partly occupied, so you don't drop the dishes or you don't whatever. Um, but it just kind of lets your mind wander. And that's part of the idea here too, right? Is this idea of daydreaming, of just freeing your mind. You're not holding on to anything, you're not grasping after anything, you're not like fighting with anything. You're just letting your mind be and flow, right? So the next time you're standing at the kitchen sink, like washing pots and pans after dinner, recognize that that's an opportunity to just let your mind go, right, and daydream, and just imagine other possibilities that maybe, again, like I said, take your mind off the rules that you've set in place, and the sort of whatever you kind of laid out for yourself, and let yourself explore other possibilities that maybe you didn't consider before. So the idea here is with doing work, and I mentioned weeding the garden a second ago, finding those sort of menial tasks where you're doing something that doesn't require a lot of focus, but is occupying you in some way, that can be a great thing, right? I know a lot of people are knitters out there, right? They do needlework, they knit or they crochet. Fantastic, right? Because again, you're able to like work with your hands, but you don't have to think about it really hard, right? And so it frees your mind up to be able to wander and to be able to daydream and do these different things, right? Letting yourself daydream. Daydreaming is not, I think sometimes like we're so into our phones all the time. Anytime we have like a spare second, we're like, oh, let me play Wordle, let me like check my email, like let me do something on my phone, let me, get on Instagram, let me do whatever. But like I think when we do that, we eliminate the possibility of our mind disengaging and letting it just wander, right? We're so afraid of margins in our lives, and we're so afraid of blank space. But like the blank spaces, that's where we doodle, right? If you think about a medieval manuscript and the illuminations in the manuscripts, they're all in the margins. The doodles, the beautiful illustrations, the gorgeous lettering, all of that stuff happens in the margins, it happens in the blank spaces, right? And we don't leave enough blank space sometimes, I think. And so part of thinking about combinatory play and recovery and dealing with resistance or dealing with feeling depleted creatively is opening up margins, is opening up the white space on the page of your day so that you can daydream, you can doodle, you can sort of have those moments, right? Okay, so another favorite technique of mine, and I've heard other, I think Aaron Sorkin does this, I've heard other writers that do this as well, is they sort of find a stretch of highway that just is your stretch of highway. And when you're feeling blocked, you drive. You just get in the car and you just drive, right? And what happens is that you get into that state of like mental flow. You might have a certain song. I know for myself, I often will have like a particular soundtrack that goes with a project that I'm working on, and so maybe I'll put that on just because it puts me in sort of the mental place. But I'm not really like, okay, I'm going to do battle with this problem that I'm having with this story. No, no, I'm just going to drive. I'm just going to drive and I'm going to put this music on that gets me kind of in the mental space, and I'm just going to see what happens, right? And try to put myself into a state of flow, of creative flow. So that can also help, right? That's another one of those things where it requires mental focus on something that's not related to your creative work, but it frees your mind up in sort of that other level to work on the story problem or to work on whatever it is that you need to work on in the background. I mentioned earlier, like working at a coffee shop or somewhere where there's like you have to kind of focus a little bit because you have to tune out the buzz that's going on around you, and that ability to selectively tune out distractions can really help to train you. So maybe that's an option as well as finding a favorite. And I know a lot of writers, at least before the pandemic, were working in coffee shops and things like that, and maybe where you're at, you're able to start doing that again. I hope so. But maybe you can start doing that again and kind of get back into that part of your routine, but be confident that that does help your brain learn to work a little bit differently to deal with distractions and be more efficient. Um, One of my favorite, okay, so going back to the definition of what combinatory play is, I mentioned earlier that combinatory play is forging new associations by putting unlike things together and observing the connections between those things, right? Allowing your brain to say, oh, that problem that I'm having over here, that's like this thing over here. And it's not necessarily you're actively doing it, it's just that your brain is able to like make the connection there, right? So how about reading poetry, right? Working in metaphor and simile is exactly this process. It is putting two unlike things together and saying, now figure out why they're related, right? This is what poetry is. This is what poetry does. So, reading some lyric poetry, writing poetry if you can, right? Training your brain to think about the world in the idea of unrelated things, right? In this connection of unrelated things, thinking in metaphor can be really, really powerful. Um, Something that I kind of thought might be a really fun exercise to try is to challenge yourself if you're going to write a description of something. Or just, kind of like you might do if you were in the garden or, sitting in a coffee shop and you just say, okay, I'm going to write a description of this coffee cup, but I'm not going to use any of the standard words that I would normally use for this object. I'm going to try to avoid describing color. I'm going to avoid describing its shape. I'm going to try to avoid describe, any number, like restrict yourself somehow and try to force yourself to communicate what that object is using a completely other vocabulary, right? What does that do for us, right? First of all, it's kind of fun. It pushes you in interesting ways, right? It pushes you to kind of, well, how would I explain that to somebody if they couldn't see the colors of it? How would I explain this if they didn't know what this shape was? Um, I did this experiment with my sixth grade science students. I used to teach sixth grade science, and I did this experiment with them, like how to explain what a book is if you can't talk about shape, right? And if you can't talk about these different things, like what would they say a book is, or how would they explain it to somebody if you couldn't say, well, it's this rectangular object that has a certain number of pages? Like, no, you're going to limit yourself definitionally to certain terms, right? So that can be a really fun way to free yourself up to see new associations, find new connections between things, right? And again, the idea here is just you're letting your mind play. You're just letting yourself be creative in a way that has no stakes, that is low stress, and you're just kind of training your mind to start looking for these new associations. So that might be something fun to try next time you kind of feel a little bit blocked or you want to just give your mind a break. In a way, it's like doing a still life painting, but in words. So just pick a random object on your desk and try to write a description of it by limiting yourself to certain words or certain terms, or take certain things off the table and say you can't talk about it in these ways. But think about what that would do for your writing. Right, if you were able to kind of incorporate some of that lyricism into your writing, how much more powerful that makes, what you do. Okay, so let's answer a couple of questions, that you may be asking at this point. Number 1, how does combinatory play release resistance? And we've been kind of talking about how this is a solution to feeling blocked. Um, so let's talk about that a little bit. What is resistance? I keep using this term, and I mentioned Stephen Pressfield's War of Art, and that's really the place where you find this term, resistance, instead of like writer's block. So Stephen Pressfield says resistance is a self generated and self perpetuated inner voice that will stop at nothing to keep you from doing your work. Okay, so it is literally like getting in your way and trying to thwart you by saying things to you, that are probably lies, as Stephen Pressfield says, it's always lying, but it's trying to prevent you from doing the work, right? And so then we get into the war with resistance. How do we get around this problem? So the idea here with combinatory play is that it's not a battle. You're not battling anything. You're working with your own mind, not against it, right? You're just letting resistance, you're just stepping out of its way, really, right? You're just stepping aside. And what's fun is you kind of trick it, right? Because it looks like you're not doing the work, right? I mentioned Archimedes earlier. It was like he's taking a bath. He's not doing the work, right? But he is doing the work. His mind is doing the work. And that's the whole secret. Einstein playing his violin when he's supposed to be figuring out the theory of relativity, that he is working, but it doesn't look like he's working. Resistance is like, "Ah, I won." No, it really hasn't won. It's maybe it looks like it's won because you're not sitting there beating your head against the keyboard, but it hasn't won, in fact, because your mind is free now to do the thing that you were sort of preventing it from doing. You were kind of getting in your own way. Well, now you're not in your own way anymore, and you can kind of do what you need to do, right? So as I say, this is kind of a fun solution. It's not doing battle. It's not sitting there and like fighting the good fight at the keyboard and like, I am going to get this 1,000 words done. If it kills me today and takes me 5 hours to do it, no, you just step out of your own way. Go do something else. When you come back after that, I bet you would find that the words will flow, right? Because you have stepped aside, you've gotten out of your own way, you've shifted gears, you've let your mind work on the problem. So when you come back to it, you're like, oh yeah, now I know what to do, right? I know what to do now. Um, To kind of use another analogy, because we're big on analogies right now, right? I mentioned Legos earlier, right? And if you've ever watched a kid play Legos, if you give them the Lego, the set that comes in the box, and it has a certain discrete number of pieces, and they all have numbers associated with them, like labels, and you give them the instructions, and they can sit there and follow the instructions and build a thing. But what if you gave that same kid a huge random box of Legos, dumped them all out on the floor, and still put the instructions in their hand and said, "Now build this thing," right? How frustrating would that be? How frustrating would that be? You have to sift through all those pieces. You're trying to find exactly the right ones that match the instructions, and you're like, this isn't working, and they're lost, and they're the wrong color, and they're not the right shape, and it's whatever. Very frustrating, right? You're trying to force yourself to follow the rules that have been laid down, and you're not allowing yourself the freedom to sort of combine things in new ways. Instead, what if you were to take that same situation, dump out the bin of Legos, and tell the kid, make a spaceship? Every kid you would give that assignment to would come up with a different design, and they would all be spaceships. They wouldn't look like the one in the book, but they would be spaceships, and they would be using random pieces, and they would have put things together in new ways, and like taken something that was supposed to be, some part of something else, and now it's part of a spaceship, right? That's kind of what we're talking about. That's the kind of process of freeing yourself up to put the pieces together in new ways without following the rules perhaps that you've set down for yourself, and allowing the new connections to emerge, right? So that's the freedom that we're kind of talking about. And I mentioned the scene that kind of reminds me of that from Apollo 13, of like dumping the random box of stuff out and say, make a filter out of this, that can fit into this particular hole on the space, on the filter, you know dock, or whatever you want to call it, that needs to be, you need to put a filter in there to get rid of the carbon dioxide. Fix it, right? Figure it out, find a way to do this. But they didn't have an instruction manual. They had to make it up. They had to recombine all of those random parts to come up with a new solution. And that's what we're trying to free our minds to be able to do. We're giving it a general instruction, and then just letting it do whatever it's going to do. Okay. So letting go of all of that and getting out of your mind's way and kind of letting it work. That's the idea behind combinatory play. Now, how does it help you to refill the tank? So if we're talking about resistance, that's one problem. And then we're talking about recovery, or like refilling the tank. If you're just feeling creatively completely depleted, how can combinatory play help you refill your creative tank? And I think this one is perhaps a little easier to see, right? You're able to use your creativity, as I mentioned before, without the stakes being super high. Nothing's riding on this particular project. You're just doing something for fun. Nobody expects you to be a great abstract artist. You're just messing around with some paint and a canvas. It's just for fun, right? It's just for fun. Making a game out of it releases some of the stakes, and that we put so much pressure on ourselves, again, which is part of where resistance comes from. And so you're just able to let yourself be, and just be inspired. The other thing too is it gives, I mentioned earlier, the margins, right? Opening up marginal space in your life to be able to allow your mind space and quiet and calm to kind of make discoveries, right? To find inspiration. Those are the things that can refill us, right? Our creative tank can get refilled that way. So finding ways to just open space up where you're not working on something, you're just being and experiencing. You're in the moment, you're just there. You're surrounded by things that inspire you. And I mentioned before, keep a running list of things that do, or places that do inspire you. As travel is starting to open back up, I mean, hopefully, I know a lot of people derive a lot of inspiration from just traveling. So hopefully that can be something that we can all add back into our list of things that help us to refill the tank, is to travel, and to experience new things. But maybe it's like trying a new recipe. Maybe it's, like I said, going on a walk in a different part of town, going to a different park, and experiencing what's there. There's a great line from the Drew Barrymore, Hugh Grant movie Music and Lyrics, which I find is really applicable. She is completely blocked. He's putting her under the gun and saying, "You need to write these lyrics for me, and we're on a deadline. We have to get this done." And she's like, "Nothing. There's nothing. It's just not happening," right? And how many of us had been in this creative situation where, like, we were on a deadline. It's very tight. There's a lot of pressure. It's very high stakes, and there's just nothing, right? And her solution is, let's go for a walk. And he's like, excuse me, like time is like flying. We have to get this done. And she says, no, we're going to go for a walk, because when you see things and you eat things and you drink things and you're out on the streets and like stuff surrounds you, it unblocks your mind. And that's exactly this process. That is exactly the process of combinatory play. We are looking for those things that unblock the mind, that take us out of that situation that's causing us so much stress, that allow us to refill our tank, to come back at the work feeling restored and refreshed and ready to go. So that's the idea, right? That's the idea behind combinatory play. That's how Einstein's solution and Agatha Christie's solution of planning your novel while you're doing the dishes can help us to not only deal with the problem of resistance in a way I think that's sort of far more cooperative with our own way of working, our own mind, but also to help us with restoring, our refilling our creative well, as we say. So that is today's work. That's what we have been talking about. We're talking about creative play. We're talking about ways of recovery. This is the third in our writing marathon series. And next week, I want to talk about what we do with those long writing sessions. I want to talk about the passion principle next week. I want to talk about how we can get the most mileage out of those longer writing sessions and how you can set yourself up for success so that you can really fly when it's time to fly, right? So how do we leverage the passion principle in order to be able to make the most out of those times when we have a long writing session? So we might think about this as being like, if we're thinking about the different stages of our writing marathon, we've talked about what the mindset is. We've talked about doing those sort of sprint or the speed training sessions that are going to help us learn how to deal with the inner critic, and talk about how to give us the sort of momentum and the mindset, the feeling of being comfortable with being uncomfortable. So if you missed last week's session, definitely check that one out. And then today we're talking about recovery and dealing with resistance in another way, and that is, doing fun things that refill the well. And so next week, then it's time finally to turn to the long run. We're going to put in the miles. We're going to see how far we can go. And so to next week's session is going to be all about the passion principle and leveraging that for long writing sessions. So I hope you all can join me back again live next week. Definitely leave me a comment. Let me know what your favorite go-to solution is for finding inspiration in the world. What is that combinatory play activity that you have found so helpful? Because maybe that might help someone else sort of get unblocked and into a better place creatively. So definitely let me know if you have a favorite go-to solution that kind of fits the Einstein model of combinatory play. I hope you all have a great and productive creative writing week, and I will see you next time on the story scene. Take care.